Welcome back, Life Science learners. Let's continue with our lesson today. We focused on nutrition in our first segment and we looked at the overview of terms and the process of the parts and their functions. In this part of the lesson, we're going to look at the process that we're referring to today in terms of what happens after chemical digestion. It's important that we understand how the body and especially the alimentary canal is structurally adapted for the absorption of nutrients. And we'll then look at how that is assimilated. It's important that we understand and have an overview of all the processes before we get into specifically absorption and assimilation. Right, so the process of digestion occurs across a number of stages, including ingestion and digestion, which we've spoke about earlier on. I'm going to try and unpack these concepts in detail in a bit. Followed by digestion is a process called absorption. We then assimilate and we take things and put them together as we needed, and we remove unwanted waste products. So what does ingestion mean? Again, the act of taking in food through the mouth is called ingestion, and that we refer to as eating food. So we ingest the food. The next bit would be digesting the food, and digestion refers to again breaking down. So the breakdown, which also includes the physical breakdown as well as the chemical breakdown. Again, in terms of the physical breakdown, we must refer to what happens in the mouth during the chewing process, as well as what happens in the stomach with the churning process between the food that mixes with the gastric juices. That is all, again, a physical mechanism of breaking down food into smaller particles or smaller building blocks. We also need to look at that digestion occurs chemically, and that we require enzymes for that process, and the enzymes that we refer to were essentially the three groups of enzymes which digest carbohydrates, your enzymes that digest your proteins, and then finally those enzymes that digest your fats. So your fatty acids and your lipids essentially are those groups that we look at. We then focus on how these are absorbed and the products and how they are transported from the digestive system into what we refer to as the bloodstream, and then from there to all cells. We also need to look at in detail the assimilation process, which essentially is how are these food products which are digested then put together and converted into what the body needs in terms of the cellular needs. Okay? And then finally, the elimination, which is the removal of the undigested food residues or parts that the body does not need, and how it's released from the body as a semi-solid fecal matter or feces. Right. So it is good to have an overview of this process, starting with how the process occurs. We looked at ingestion, then from ingestion to digestion, the process of absorption, finally ending with egestion. Right, that's a good overview of the flow diagram of this process of digestion. Let's have an overview of the drawing of the digestive system and try and unpack again a basic function of each of the parts. Okay, again, we looked at the mouth, again where food then mixes with saliva and it's broken down chemically with the enzymes produced by the salivary glands, along with the digestion that happens mechanically by the teeth, which forms a ball of food called the bolus. That bolus moves down the esophagus, which is a muscular tube through which the food is transported to the stomach. Guys, in the stomach we see it is a muscular bag lined with mucus, which is important in protecting the stomach. Strong enzymes are released which are acidic in nature, and that begins the process of protein digestion. All of that is mixed with the gastric juices to form what we refer to as chyme, and that chyme then moves into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum, which is right here. We also need to recognize the presence of the pancreas, which serves both as a endocrine gland because it produces hormones, as well as an exocrine gland because it produces enzymes. And so we see that the pancreas produces secretions directly into the duodenum. As we continue into the small intestine, we know that it is made up of three parts: the duodenum, the ileum, and then the jejunum. The ileum is the last part that connects to the large intestine, which contains the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and then finally the descending colon. And this is where most of the water and ions are absorbed. And water plays an important part in our digestion process. It's because it allows for water to be a chemical solution in which most of the chemical reactions happen. It also forms a transport medium for the ions that are transported along the digestive system. And finally, we find the rectum, in which the undigested food and the waste products are temporarily stored, and then the anus, which is the opening through which the waste products are released. Let's go further up to the liver and unpack the importance of the liver. The liver is an important gland or organ that produces bile. That bile is stored in the gallbladder, and that gallbladder concentrates the bile and then releases the bile into the duodenum. The liver plays an important role in detoxifying certain molecules, so alcohol, the medication and drugs that we take are all detoxified by the liver. It also stores some important vitamins, iron, as well as glycogen. And glycogen is an important complex carbohydrate that the body stores and keeps. When needed, that glycogen is converted back into glucose to provide energy. Okay, and that's again a wrap of the overview of the digestive system. Let's focus specifically on the small intestine, because that is where we're going with today. We're going to look at the process of how absorption takes place. Again, if we talk about the small intestine, the yellow bit there is the duodenum. We've got the middle bit called the jejunum here, and I've indicated that with a key at the bottom. And then the last bit, which is the ileum, which connects to the large colon. And that is the ascending colon, moving across the transverse colon, further coming down the descending colon, finally ending with the rectum and an opening called the anus. Guys, it's important that we recognize that there's a structure here called the appendix, which is a vestigial structure, a part that we no longer need and has become redundant or has lost its significant function. And that has got to do with how the diet of humans have changed, and hence the need for this appendix no longer has become obsolete, and we can actually survive without an appendix. Right, so let's look at the internal structure of the small intestine. So remember that the intestine is a long tube that is highly coiled. However, when we take a section through that, essentially when we cut through this tube and look at a cross section or a transverse section through it, we see that there are many folds on the internal lining filled with finger-like projections lining the internal lumen. So this is the internal lumen through which the food passes. Lining that on the internal surface are finger-like projections called villi. Here I've zoomed into some of these finger-like projections called villi. Let's unpack that now. So the walls of the small intestine have the following important layers. The outer layer of longitudinal muscles. Again, throughout the digestive system, we've got muscles lining the digestive system. These are a combination of longitudinal muscles that run along the digestive system, along with an inner layer on the inside of that called circular muscles. And so these muscles work antagonistically, meaning opposite each other. When one contracts, the other relaxes. And that muscle action allows for the esophagus and the alimentary canal to move and push food along. So that you would see here, you've got your layer of your longitudinal muscles followed with your circular muscles in there. A highly folded inner epithelial layer which absorbs the digested food is present in this area here. So that's your epithelial lining, which is further modified to become structurally suited for its function. So let's look at the inner epithelium. The inner epithelial lining of the intestine is highly folded with finger-like projections called villi. A singular for that will be the villus. So here we can see many villi, which are these finger-like projections projecting into the internal lumen. Here we see them extending into the internal lumen. Many villi will protrude into the intestinal lumen, greatly increasing the available surface area for absorption. So if we were to look through the digestive system and a cross-section through the small intestine, it is not a hollow tube. Within it, you've got lots of finger-like projections, as you see. And the concept behind this is that if we were to unpack that and if we were to straighten this layer out, so if that's the fold, and if we were to stretch this out, it will probably now have a much larger surface area. So combine several of these villi, and that line, or this total surface area through which absorption can take place, becomes significantly longer. It means now we've got a larger surface through which the absorption of the nutrients can take place. And that's a remarkable adaptation that we see in terms of the efficiency of the small intestine for maximizing how nutrients are absorbed. Okay, cool. So guys, on closer inspection, we can look at the structure of the small intestine. We can see that these finger-like projections project into the internal lumen. So here's the lumen, and this is where food and the nutrients are passing through once they are digested. It is through these finger-like projections that these monomers are absorbed. You can see that the internal core is filled with lots of blood capillaries, arteries and veins that are there to efficiently absorb and transport the nutrients away. Well guys, that was a wrap for the first segment. We've had an overview of the digestive system. We've looked at the parts. We've kind of looked at the overview of what happens when digestion occurs. It's important that we now get into the process of absorption. Let's have a little break and I'll see you in a bit.